In this video, we're going to learn about Spring MVC form validation for required fields. What we'll do here is we'll have this example. We'll have a form where we ask for a customer's first name and last name. And here what we'd like to do is make the last name required. So if they hit the submit button with an empty form, then we'll give an error message saying, hey, last name is required. And now let's take a look at the big picture. So here we'll have our customer form. The user enters their data, they hit submit, pass over a customer object to our customer controller, and the customer controller will actually perform the validation. If the validation is successful, we'll send them to the confirmation page. If the validation fails, then we'll send them back to the customer form for them to fix up the form and resubmit again. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the development process. In the first step, we're going to create the customer class and add validation rules. Next, we'll add the controller code to show the HTML form. Alrighty, so moving ahead to step 3, we're going to develop the HTML form and add validation support. And then in step 4, we'll perform the validation in the controller class. And then finally in step 5, we'll create the confirmation page. Starting here with the first step of creating the customer class and adding validation rules. Now remember, in our example, we want to add a validation rule to the last name and make it required. What we'll have to do is make use of these two annotations here, null and size. So for null, we'll give the error message is required. That'll display if the value is actually null. Also, we want to have size min equals 1, meaning that we need to have a minimum of 1 character here to make sure this is not empty. So we're just checking for null and size on the given last name. Those are the validation rules that we've just added to this customer class. And note, for the first name, there's nothing on it. So in this case, there's no validation rules for the first name field. Now moving ahead to step 2, we're going to add the controller code to show the HTML form. We set up the get mapping for /. This will map to the root URL so we can show our HTML form directly. So here we're making use of HTML form binding. And so we pass in the model. The model is a special object that allows us to share information between controllers and view pages. We can basically add information to the model in the controller, and then the view page can actually access that data from the model. For the model, we need to create an instance of the customer class and add it as a model attribute. We provide the name and the value. The name is important because this is the name that we'll reference in the HTML form, and also that's the name that we'll use when we process the HTML form. Since we're using HTML form data binding, we must provide a model attribute to the form. Finally, we return the string customer form, and this will map over to the timely file customerform.html. Alrighty, so moving ahead to step 3, we're going to develop the HTML form and add validation support. Here's our customerform.html. For the form, we'll make use of the th action. This tells it where to submit the form data. And since we're using form data binding, we need to give the reference here to the model attribute named customer. And it's the same name that we used from the previous slide in the controller as far as adding that model attribute. And then here we'll send the data over using HTTP post. For the first name field, we make use of the input type equals text, and then we give th field equals first name. This maps to the first name property on the customer class. And then we repeat the process for the last name field. And just make note of the special notation there for the star, curly braces, and the actual name of the property. And now we need to add this new entry here to show the error message if present. Based on our previous code for customer class, we know we added a validation rule to the last name field, so there may be a validation error on that field. So we give this reference here to actually show that given item. And then we also apply a CSS class. The actual name of that class is error. I'll get into the details on the CSS for that in the actual coding video. But for now, let's just assume that there's a CSS class named error and we can use it accordingly. But we'll get into all that in the actual coding video. Moving along to step number 4, this is where we actually perform the validation in the controller class. Here's our method here for this post mapping of process form. We have 2 new items here as far as parameters. The first one is called valid. So this is a new annotation. Basically, we're saying perform validation rules on this customer object. And since we're using form data binding, we need to give the reference here to the model attribute named customer. Also, the results of that validation will be placed in this object binding result. So binding result will be the result of the actual validation. So behind the scenes, when Spring calls this method, Spring will actually perform the validation rules using the validator API, and then the results will be placed in the object binding result. In your code, you can check the value of the binding result and see if it has any errors. So here in the coding, I can say if binding result has errors, then we'll send the user back to the customer form. Else, that means there are no errors, we'll simply send the user to the confirmation page. All right, so that's the basic approach here. You simply check the binding result. If there are errors, send them back to the form, else send them over to the confirmation page or whatever success page you have for your application. And then finally, step 5, very simple, we create our confirmation page. We say, hey, the customer's confirmed, and we get the customer's first name and also the customer's last name. So nothing really big here, just simple Spring MVC coding. All right, that's it. So in the next video, we'll actually dive in, we'll move into the IDE, and we'll actually start writing some code, and we'll see how all this works together in real time. All righty, I'll see ya in the next video. Alrighty, let's get started with our development process. And this video will cover step 1 of creating a customer class and adding validation rules. Let's go ahead and move in here and let's create a new class for customer. And again, the name of that class is customer. And this class is very simple. We'll have a customer first name and last name. And then I'll also go ahead and generate the getters and setters. And be sure that you have both selected, first name and last name. Excellent. So we have our getters and setters in place for our 2 fields, first name and last name. Now the next step here is adding the validation rules. And we know that we want last name to be a required field. We'll make use of the annotation not null, and we give the error message is required. Just fix the imports here. And now I'll just do a little copy paste on this. And for this next annotation here, I'll say size min equals 1. Fix the imports. Now let's zoom in here for a second. Your IDE may show some additional warnings. The first warning here is not null fields must be initialized. Alrighty, I'll go ahead and initialize this to an empty string. And then also your IDE may show another warning. Here it says the generated code will use org.jetbrains instead of Jakarta, but that's not what I want. I want to make use of the Jakarta annotations instead of JetBrains because there's no need for org.jetbrains dependencies when using Spring MVC validation. So go ahead and select the option here to make Jakarta validation the default annotation. Alrighty, so that should resolve those IDE warnings. Now you may see those, you may not, depending on your IDE configuration, but I just wanted to go through that process here in this video. And then at the top, just do a checkpoint, make sure that you have the Jakarta annotations imported accordingly. Alrighty, so this looks good. So this is the coding here in place for making the last name field required. Good job.